This video is brought to you by GiveWell. An attempted coup is underway in Central America as authorities in Guatemala try to block the accession of President-Elect Bernardo Arévalo, who, having campaigned on a strong anti-corruption platform, won a strong victory in this year's election. In a region where democracy is said to be backsliding, in places such as El Salvador and Nicaragua, the situation in Guatemala is serious. So in this video, we'll explain what's going on and whether this so-called slow-motion coup could succeed. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. We're going to start by going back to the summer of this year, when Guatemala held its presidential election. With conservative incumbent President Alejandro Giammattei constitutionally limited to a single term, the country was bound to get a new president. However, the result was a shock. Bernardo Arévalo, a broadly centre-left anti-corruption campaigner, seemingly came out of nowhere and placed second in the first round vote in June, and went on to win the runoff in August with a strong 61% of the vote, beating political insider and former First Lady Sandra Torres. Arévalo, by the way, is the son of the country's first democratically elected president and was a diplomat and sociologist before founding the pro-democracy and anti-corruption Semilla movement in 2017. For some context, Guatemala has in recent years seen its democracy backslide and corruption deepen. For example, in the late 2010s, the UN-backed International Commission Against Impunity was effectively shut down, and authorities have been accused of targeting those involved in the Commission's anti-corruption efforts. Since then, dozens of judges, magistrates and prosecutors have reportedly fled the country, facing legal persecution by the political establishment, sometimes dubbed the Corrupt Pact. Ahead of this year's election, a number of competitive candidates from across the political spectrum were disqualified, largely for alleged irregularities or alleged breaches of procedural rules that didn't appear to be applied consistently to the more establishment-friendly candidates. Before the first round on June the 25th, Bernardo Arévalo had been flying under the radar with poll numbers in the low single digits, so was not seen as much of a competitor. But he ended up vastly outperforming those polls and came second with 15.5%, qualifying for the runoff. Suddenly, he became a competitive candidate, especially as he was now up against former First Lady Sandra Torres, a perennial candidate who had lost the runoff vote in the last two elections. However, it was at this point that the efforts to derail Arévalo began. Shortly after the first round, several establishment political parties petitioned the Constitutional Court alleging voter fraud, which, by the way, was not the conclusion of international observers. The court ordered a review of the tallies and told the Supreme Electoral Tribunal to hold off on certifying the first round results, but after a few days, the initial results were upheld and certified. However, on that same day, July the 12th, a judge suspended Arévalo's Semilla party with just over a month to go until the runoff, following a request from the Attorney General's office that accused the party of forging signatures for its registration. Then, in a dramatic turnaround a day later, following domestic protests and international concern, the Constitutional Court overturned the party's suspension, as the law prohibits parties from being suspended between the calling of an election and the election date. Furthermore, during the lead-up to the August the 20th runoff, the Attorney General's office carried out numerous raids, including of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal and Semilla Party headquarters. Nevertheless, Bernardo Arévalo went on to win a resounding victory in the runoff, which international observers endorsed, and President Giammattei promised an orderly transition. But with a nearly 5-month transition period before the scheduled inauguration on January the 14th, efforts to disrupt or block Arévalo have only intensified, largely led by Attorney General Maria Consuelo Porras, who has been designated a corrupt actor by the US State Department since 2021. Having won the election, Arévalo's party was once again suspended by authorities, and the Attorney General's office carried out further raids on the Supreme Electoral Tribunal's facilities, taking the unprecedented step of opening boxes of ballots and photographing the contents. In addition to this, the Attorney General has, at least 3 times, asked a court to strip Arévalo and his Vice President-elect of their immunity from prosecution, seeking to pursue a case against him for alleged complicity, because of his tweets in the student takeover of a university last year. Early in December, 3 judges from the Supreme Electoral Tribunal reportedly fled Guatemala shortly after Congress stripped the magistrates of their immunity, representing another angle of attack from the ruling establishment. In the face of all this, opposition activists and indigenous groups have led protests in support of Arévalo, demanding the resignation of the Attorney General and her allies, and denouncing what's been described as a slow-motion judicial coup. However, the crisis escalated further on December the 8th, when prosecutors from the Attorney General's office said in a press conference that the election results should be declared null and void, though it's worth pointing out that the legal power to do so is not in their hands. The announcement prompted strong condemnation from outside parties. The EU called it an attempt at a coup d'etat, spearheaded by politically motivated prosecutors, while the Organization of American States also calling it a coup attempt, describing the action as typical of dictatorships and not democracies. The UN expressed alarm, and the United States condemned the attempt to, quote, delegitimize Guatemala's free and fair elections and prevent the peaceful transition of power. In a bid to push back against the actions of the Attorney General's office, the US has imposed visa restrictions on nearly 300 Guatemalans, including more than 100 members of Congress. In response to the latest action, Bernardo Arévalo vowed that he would take office in January and condemned the, quote, ongoing coup as absurd, ridiculous and perverse. The Supreme Electoral Tribunal backed him up, saying that the election results were unchangeable and that preventing a transition would be a break in the constitutional order. Just days later, the Attorney General's office sought to withdraw the tribunal head's legal immunity. However, in what might be the last major act in this drawn-out saga, the Constitutional Court, the country's highest court, responded to a case brought by a group of lawyers seeking to guarantee democracy, and ordered on Thursday that the transition of power must go ahead, and that Arévalo, his vice president, and elected officials must take office in January. It's worth noting, though, that the court did note that its ruling was without prejudice to any investigations carried out by the Attorney General's office, so long as they don't prevent the completion of the transition process. If Arévalo does take office, it will have taken a whole load of domestic pressure, both on the street and in the legal system, plus significant international pressure to guarantee the transition of power. But given the onslaught of legal challenges he has faced already, Bernardo Arévalo probably won't take anything for granted until he's actually inaugurated on January the 14th. And even then, that is when the hard work of tackling the deeply entrenched corruption begins. There are over 1.5 million non-profit organisations in the US, and millions more around the world. So how do you know which ones make the biggest impact with your donations? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They spend tens of thousands of hours poring over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-based organisations that are saving and improving lives. In fact, GiveWell has now spent over 15 years researching charitable organisations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. That's things like bed nets for as little as $5, which can reduce the number of malaria infections in impacted regions, and enough nets can lead to a significant drop in infections and thus boost life expectancy. Together, over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $1 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 150,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. In fact, in 2019, when we sold TLDR-branded pin badges for charity, we turned to GiveWell to help select the charities we donated to, ensuring the maximum impact of our giving. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. As such, you can find all their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Plus, if you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org, pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout. Do make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR News in order to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.